The chisel catches the grain at exactly the right angle. Wood peels away in translucent ribbons. Each stroke removes material measured in thousandths of an inch. The pattern maker's hand doesn't pause. It doesn't correct. It simply knows. On the workbench sits a half-finished wooden form, curved, tapered, polished on one side, rough on the other. It looks like a sculpture, but it isn't art. It's a pattern. And before CNC machines carved metal in computer-controlled silence, before 3D printers built forms layer by layer from digital files, every casting that came out of an American foundry began here. In the hands of a pattern maker, with wood, with calipers, with memory built across decades of repetition. This is the craft that built the factories. In a foundry, metal is poured into sand molds to create parts, engine blocks, pipe fittings, machine housings, gears. But sand doesn't hold a shape on its own. It needs something to press against. That something was the pattern. Pattern makers carved precise replicas of the final casting, but with critical modifications. They calculated shrinkage, because molten iron contracts as it cools. They added draft angles, so the pattern could be pulled from the sand without collapsing the mold. They designed parting lines, the exact plane where the two halves of the mold would separate. Every pattern was a problem solved in 3 dimensions, and the tolerances were merciless. A pattern off by 5/1000ths of an inch could ruin a casting worth thousands of dollars. It could jam a production line. It could crack under pressure in the field. So pattern makers worked slow. If you grew up around a workshop like this, you'll recognize that sound. The whisper of a hand plane taking paper-thin shavings. The tap-tap-tap of a chisel finding the line. The silence between measurements. Walk into a pattern shop in 1960, and the tools look older than the building. Hand planes with rosewood handles worn smooth. Chisels sharpened so many times the blades are half their original width. Calipers that open and close with the friction of 60 years of use. Some of these tools aren't made anymore. The manufacturers closed. The steel formulas changed. The craftsmen who could sharpen them properly retired without replacements. Pattern makers kept them alive anyway. They learned to grind their own chisels. They modified modern tools to behave like old ones. They salvaged planes from estate sales and flea markets, rebuilding them in their own shops. Because the tool and the hand were one thing. You couldn't simply pick up a new chisel and work to the same precision. The weight was different, and the balance was wrong. The edge held differently. Mastery wasn't just knowledge. It was also the relationship between a specific hand and a specific tool, built across years of repetition. A pattern begins with a blueprint. The engineer provides dimensions for the final casting. The pattern maker translates those dimensions into wood, accounting for shrinkage, draft, and mold mechanics. For gray iron, shrinkage is 1/8 inch per foot. For aluminum, it's 5/32. For bronze, it's 3/16. These numbers live in the body. A master pattern maker doesn't calculate shrinkage with a pencil. He feels it. He's made enough patterns for gray iron that his hands move automatically to the correct dimension. The wood itself requires judgment. Mahogany for patterns that will be used hundreds of times. It's stable. It doesn't warp. It takes fine detail. Pine for short-run patterns. Cheaper. Faster to carve. Good enough for 20 castings. White pine for cores. Cherry for patterns that need a glass-smooth finish. The grain matters. Carve across the grain, and the wood tears. Carve with the grain, and it peels clean. But the grain doesn't run straight. It curves. It shifts. It hides knots and voids that only reveal themselves under the chisel. Reading wood is not something you learn from a book. Morning light comes through high windows, catching dust in the air. The pattern maker arrives early. The shop is cold. He lights a small heater near the workbench, not for comfort, but because wood changes dimension with temperature. A pattern carved in a cold shop will be undersized by the afternoon. He selects a blank, a block of mahogany, already dried and stable, rough cut to approximate size. The blueprint is pinned to the wall. He studies it for 5 minutes without touching anything. Then he begins. The bandsaw removes bulk material. The hand plane flattens reference surfaces, and the spokes halve carves the first curve. Every few minutes, he stops and measures. Calipers check diameter. A combination square checks angles. A straight edge checks flatness. The measuring is constant, because wood forgives nothing. Once removed, it cannot be replaced. A mistake on a CNC machine can be reset with a button. A mistake in hand-carved wood is permanent. By noon, the rough form is visible. By evening, the surface is within 10,000ths of final dimension. Where are you watching from? Are trades like this still alive in your town? The next day, he'll finish it. Sandpaper wrapped around a wooden block, working through grits. 80, 120, 180, 220. Not for aesthetics, for function. A rough pattern creates a rough casting. A smooth pattern creates a smooth mold. The final step is sealing. Shellac or lacquer, applied thin, built up in layers. This keeps moisture from warping the wood. It keeps sand from sticking during molding. It extends the pattern's life from 50 castings to 500. Then the pattern goes to the foundry, and the pattern maker starts the next one. You can teach someone to read a blueprint. You can teach them to use a caliper. You can teach them shrinkage tables and draft angle calculations. But you cannot teach them to feel when a chisel is about to catch the grain wrong. You cannot teach them how much pressure to apply to a hand plane on the 15th stroke of a curve. You cannot teach them to see a parting line in 3 dimensions before the pattern is carved. That knowledge comes from repetition. 5,000 patterns, 10,000, 20,000, and it lives in the hands. When CNC machining arrived in the 1980s, foundries could program a computer to carve patterns from solid blocks of urethane foam. Faster, more consistent. No shrinkage calculations needed. The software handled it. No draft angle errors. The toolpath was perfect. The patterns looked identical. But something was lost. A CNC machine cannot adjust mid-cut based on how the material feels. It cannot recognize that a particular casting will have cooling stresses that require a slight modification to the pattern geometry. It cannot look at a blueprint and say, "This won't mold cleanly." That judgment came from experience. And when the pattern makers retired, the judgment left with them. In 1970, there were thousands of pattern makers in America. By 2000, there were hundreds. Today, there are dozens. Maybe someone in your family worked a trade like this. The foundries didn't close all at once. Some moved overseas. Some automated. Some simply stopped getting orders as manufacturing shifted away from castings toward welded assemblies and injection molded plastics. The pattern shops closed with them, and the apprenticeships disappeared. A pattern maker named Robert Henning worked in a shop outside Pittsburgh for 43 years. He trained 6 apprentices in the 1970s. 4 of them left for higher-paying work in machine shops. 1 became a CNC programmer. 1 stayed. That last apprentice, his name was Michael, took over the shop when Robert retired in 1998. Michael is 61 now. He is not trained an apprentice. Not because he doesn't want to, but because there's no one to train. The foundries that still use hand-carved patterns are few, and they're not hiring. The young workers who might have been interested 30 years ago are learning CAD software and 3D printing instead. Michael still takes commissions, art foundries, historical restorations, custom one-off castings for vintage machinery. But it's not production work, it's specialty work. And when he retires, the shop will close. The tools will be sold. The patterns will go to museums or scrap bins, and the knowledge will go with him. There are still pattern makers working. They're in their 60s and 70s. They work alone or in pairs. They take commissions from niche industries, aerospace restoration, historical preservation, custom sculpture casting. Some teach workshops, 1-week courses where hobbyists and woodworkers learn the basics of pattern making. They carve small forms. They learn to read calipers. They hear stories about the foundry days. But a 1-week course is not an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship was 5 years of daily repetition. 5 years of mistakes and corrections. So 5 years of watching a master's hands until your own hands moved the same way. That system is gone. If you've ever watched hands move like this, you know it's different from watching a screen. The foundries that remain use 3D printed patterns now. They're made from resin, cured under UV light, delivered in days instead of weeks. They work. They're affordable. They're precise. But they're not carved. And when something goes wrong, when a casting has an unexpected defect, when a mold collapses, when a core shifts, there's no pattern maker to adjust the geometry by feel. There's only the CAD file. And the CAD file doesn't know what the sand will do. Michael still keeps his shop open 4 days a week. He arrives early. The light comes through the same windows. The dust floats in the same shafts of sun. He carves patterns the way he always has. Slow, precise, measured to thousandths. He knows this will not last much longer. Not because the work isn't good, but because the world doesn't need it the way it used to. Have you seen a workshop like this close in your lifetime? He's made peace with that. But some nights, when the shop is quiet and the tools are cleaned and put away, he thinks about the knowledge that will leave with him. As the way a chisel sounds when it's perfectly sharp, the way mahogany smells when it's planed at the right angle, the way a finished pattern feels in your hands, balanced, smooth, exact. These things were not written down. They were learned by doing. And when the doing stops, the knowing stops too. Skill lives in hands, and hands do not last forever. Under this video, there's a subscribe button. It's a small action, but it helps keep stories like this alive. If craftsmanship still matters to you, if you believe skill deserves to be remembered, subscribing simply means you want these trades documented while they're still here. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Is there still a blacksmith in your town? A shoe repair shop? A workshop that smells like oil and wood? Have you lived this life? Or watched it fade? Share your story in the comments. That's how these trades stay visible.